There's a certain kind of silence that shows up right before your own family turns on you. I know that silence now. I learned it the same year I came home for good after 22 years in the Army, thinking the hardest part of my life was finally over. I was wrong. I want to tell you about the night I stood in a doorway that wasn't locked to her anymore, watching a woman I'd tried to love for years let herself into my house with a key I never gave her. She thought I didn't see her. She thought, after everything, I still wouldn't fight back. She looked around my living room like she was checking on something that belonged to her. Then she whispered something to herself, quiet, almost tender, like she believed it completely. This family still needs me more than it needs her. I didn't say a word. I just started paying attention. The day I retired, a colonel I barely knew shook my hand and told me I'd earned a quiet life. After 22 years, quiet didn't feel like a reward. It felt like a language I'd have to relearn. Eric picked me up from the airport in Colorado Springs and hugged me so hard I felt my spine pop. "You're really here," he said. "For good this time." "For good," I said. I meant it. I don't think he did. Not the way I meant it, because Eric's version of home had quietly changed while I was gone, and I hadn't been there to notice. I noticed the moment we walked through the door. A recliner in the corner, angled toward the window, worn in a particular way. "That's just where Mom sits when she's here," Eric said, setting down my bags like it was nothing. "I don't know what I would have done without her, honestly." There were things about civilian life I hadn't told him, not fully, that first week. The way a car backfiring 2 streets over could steal my breath for a few seconds before my brain caught up and told me I was safe. The way I still woke at 5 every morning out of habit, standing alone in the kitchen before the house stirred, needing that hour of stillness before the day asked anything of me. I'd learned over 2 decades to carry these things quietly, and I told myself that was strength. For a long time, I believed it was the only kind available to me. I asked Eric once that first week why he'd never mentioned how involved his mother had become while I was gone. He shrugged, the way he did whenever a question made him uncomfortable. "I didn't want to worry you overseas." And honestly, it was just easier to let her help than argue about it. Easier for who? For everyone, he said and kissed my forehead like that answered the question. I didn't understand yet that I was watching the exact pattern that would define the next several months, my husband choosing the path of least resistance, again and again mistaking it for kindness. Brenda showed up 2 days later with a casserole and a smile so warm it took me a full minute to feel the chill underneath it. She walked past me into my kitchen like she'd done it 1,000 times because she had. "I kept things running while you were away," she said. "Someone had to." That first Sunday, she invited half the neighborhood over for a welcome home lunch. I never planned, standing by my grill telling a neighbor named Carol how proud she was of her Samantha. "All those years overseas," she said, loud enough for me to hear. "You have no idea what that does to a person." Carol nodded solemnly, glancing at me like I might crack open right there by the grill. By the following week, she was rearranging my throw pillows without asking, donating boxes of my things because they looked too military, and telling neighbors, loud enough for me to hear, that after so many deployments, Samantha isn't quite the same anymore. She started weighing in on things that had nothing to do with her, too, small opinions delivered like settled fact. She didn't like how I organized the pantry. She thought I should switch our cell phone plan to the one she used. Dinner plans changed without me knowing more than once, the first time when I'd already started cooking and Eric came in to tell me, almost apologetically, that we were expected at his mother's instead. "She already invited the Hendersons," he said, like that settled it. "Your mother donated my things," I told Eric, holding the empty space where a box used to sit. "Mom was only trying to help," he said, and I nodded, the way I'd trained myself to nod for 22 years whenever something felt wrong and the room wasn't ready to hear it. I'm sure she believed that. The rumors started small after that. A neighbor asked if I was doing okay, her voice pitched with careful sympathy. Carol stopped me at the mailbox one afternoon, lowering her voice like she was offering me a kindness. "If you ever need someone to talk to, there's no shame in it. Brenda told me a little about what you all go through over there. I'm not judging." "I'm not sure what she told you," I said, But I'm doing just fine, Carol. She patted my arm the exact way Brenda always did, and I understood, standing at the end of my own driveway, that Brenda hadn't just been talking about me behind closed doors. She'd handed a story about me to the whole street, one warm conversation at a time. There were still good moments, that first month, and I want to be honest about those too, because the truth of it wasn't all warning signs and unease. Some evenings, Eric and I sat on the back steps with 2 beers and no agenda, and he'd ask me real questions about deployment, not the polite kind people ask at dinner parties, but the kind that meant he actually wanted to know. I told him about the sound convoys made at 4 in the morning, about the particular quiet of a base right before dawn. He listened the way he used to listen when we were newly married, before 22 years of distance had put a layer of politeness between the parts of ourselves we let each other see. Those nights made the rest of it harder to name, if I'm being honest. It's difficult to call a house unsafe when the man inside it still makes you laugh until your stomach hurts. Brenda's damage never announced itself as an emergency. It just quietly ate away at the edges of something that was otherwise, in its best hours, still worth protecting. Then came the key. I came home from the grocery store one Thursday to find my front door unlocked and Brenda already inside, putting away groceries I hadn't bought. "How did you get in?" "Eric had a key made for me years ago," she said, unbothered. "It seemed practical at the time." "You never told me that," I said to Eric. "It never seemed important," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Healthy families respect boundaries," I told Brenda. She smiled. "Soldiers always see enemies where there aren't any." Days later, she apologized over Sunday dinner, said she'd bring back the spare key, said she wanted to do better. I believed her for about 3 days, until I found a hardware store receipt in the recycling bin, dated the same week, for a key duplicated all over again. Around the same time, I found a $300 transfer on our joint bank statement, made out to a landscaping company Brenda had recommended. Eric hadn't mentioned it. Then I overheard her on the phone with him, telling him to hold off on the joint savings account we'd planned to open, that marriages need stability and we should wait a year. He listened to her. He always listened to her. A few days after the key confrontation, Brenda brought up something new over Sunday coffee, phrased so casually it almost slipped past me. "I was thinking," she said, stirring her cup, not looking at either of us, "it might just be easier if I kept a key permanently, for emergencies. What if something happened to one of you and I couldn't get in?" "We have Linda's number for emergencies," I said, "and a neighbor with a spare." "It's not the same as family," she said, and there it was again, that word, wielded like it settled every argument on its own. Eric hesitated, weighing his mother's disappointment against what he and I had just fought about days earlier. "Mom, I think we already talked about this." "I'm not trying to start anything," Brenda said, holding up both hands, wounded. "I just worry." I didn't answer. I let the silence sit there instead, and for once it did more work than anything I could have said. That was the moment I stopped hoping and started watching. I ordered a video doorbell that same week and installed it myself without telling anyone. My challenge coin, the one I'd carried through every deployment, went from the kitchen drawer into my pocket and it stayed there. Linda, Eric's cousin and a retired Army nurse, caught my arm in the driveway one afternoon that same week. "Military discipline teaches you to absorb pressure," she said quietly. "Controlling people mistake that for permission." I didn't answer her. I didn't know what to say yet, but I didn't forget it either. That night, lying awake beside Eric while he slept, steady and untroubled, I thought about the last convoy I'd led 3 years earlier, how I'd trained myself to notice the smallest change in a road I traveled every day, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. You didn't wait for the explosion to know something was wrong. You learned to read the quiet first. I didn't know yet that I'd be using that same training in my own living room. I just knew that some old, careful part of me had already woken up. I didn't have to wait long. The first motion alert came a few nights later. Brenda's key turning in the lock. Her walking down our hallway alone, stopping, looking around like she was deciding whether the house was already hers. Then, quiet, almost to herself, "This family still needs me more than it needs her." I watched it 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't call Eric. I opened my laptop and started a folder. I named it, simply, Evidence. Once Brenda understood I wasn't going to confront her out loud, she stopped being careful. She started making decisions for us entirely, hiring contractors, changing plans, telling relatives I needed rest on days I wasn't even home. The rumors spread through the whole street, one warm, concerned conversation at a time, until neighbors were patting my arm the same practiced way Brenda did. The night it broke wide open, we were at her table for Sunday dinner. 12 people, and Brenda tapped her wine glass with a fork. "I've been doing some research on veterans' wellness facilities," she said, looking straight at me. "Samantha deserves a peaceful place to recover." The table went silent. Eric laughed nervously. "Mom, come on." She wasn't joking. Down at the far end of the table, a teenage niece looked up from her phone for the first time all night, sensing that something real had just happened in a room full of adults pretending otherwise. Eric's uncle cleared his throat and reached for his water glass, and I understood, watching all of it, that most of these people weren't cruel. They were simply uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people rarely choose the harder, riskier act of standing up for someone being discussed like she isn't in the room. "Why would I need to leave my own home?" I asked, calm, quiet. "Because sometimes the people we love need professional help before they realize it," she said. "Retirement isn't confusing," I said. "Discipline just sounds different from drama." Nobody spoke for the rest of that dinner. That night, I went through weeks of doorbell footage and messages, building a timeline, dating everything, the way I used to log details in the field. I found voicemails where she told relatives she'd handled worse than this. I found texts where she called herself the one who makes the real decisions in that house. Linda, Eric's cousin and a retired Army nurse, found me at my kitchen table 2 nights later and didn't say a word about it being excessive. "You've spent years protecting people overseas," she said. "It's time someone protected you." "I don't know how to ask for that," I told her. "You don't have to ask," Linda said. "You just have to let someone in." Eric found the footage himself not long after, sitting alone with his phone, watching his mother walk through our hallway like she owned it. His face went pale. For the first time in years, he had proof instead of excuses. He confronted her 2 days later. "Mom, you crossed a line," he told her. "I'm trying to save your marriage," she said. "No," he said. "You're trying to control it." She apologized. She promised to return every key. For 4 days, she disappeared completely. Then the invitations started. An aunt calling, gentle and concerned. A cousin wanting to check in as a family. Linda called me before anyone else could. "Brenda's organizing an intervention," she said. "She's telling people your PTSD has gotten severe, that you're refusing treatment." "I'm going," I told her. "Good," Linda said. "Bring everything." I slipped the challenge coin into my pocket that morning without really looking at it. It had stopped being something I needed to touch for reassurance. It had become something I simply carried, the way you carry your own name. Eric reached over once at a red light and put his hand over mine on the console. Neither of us said anything about it. We didn't need to. Brenda's street looked exactly like it always did. Tidy lawns, a wreath still hanging on her door from some holiday months past. It struck me, walking up that familiar walkway, how ordinary it all looked for what was about to happen inside. We drove to Brenda's house the next morning, mostly in silence. Nearly the entire extended family was already seated when we walked in, every chair facing one empty seat in the center of the room. Linda sat near the back, giving me the smallest nod as I came through the door, the kind of nod that says, "I'm here and I see you." Brenda smiled at me, warm and certain. "Samantha, please, sit down." "We're all here because we love you." I sat, my laptop bag on my knees, and let them talk. Relatives cried. An aunt said she just wanted me to get help. Eric's uncle stared at his hands and said nothing. A cousin mentioned, gently, that maybe the transition home had been harder than I let on, and that there was no shame in admitting it. Even the teenage niece from Sunday dinner sat curled into the corner of the couch, watching me with an expression somewhere between worry and confusion, clearly unsure why the adults in her family were treating this like a solemn occasion. I didn't interrupt a single person. I listened to a room full of people I loved describe a version of me that had never existed anywhere except in Brenda's carefully constructed story. When the room finally quieted, waiting for my response, I stood, connected my laptop to the television, and said, "I'd like to show you something. Then you can decide for yourselves." I didn't raise my voice. I pressed play. The first video showed Brenda letting herself in on a day she'd claimed the door was unlocked. The timestamp proved otherwise. The second showed her alone in our hallway at night, whispering the sentence I'd first heard through my own front door. I played the messages where she told relatives I needed rest while I wasn't even home. I played the voicemail where she said she'd handled worse than this. I showed the hardware store receipt for a key duplicated 3 days after her apology. I showed the email she'd sent to 12 relatives describing symptoms I'd never had, the words unstable and untreated built into a version of me designed for exactly this room. I let each piece sit in the silence for a moment before moving to the next, the way you present findings when you want people to reach their own conclusions instead of being handed one. Somewhere behind me, someone gasped. One cousin stood and walked out. An aunt began crying for a different reason now, her hand pressed to her chest, looking at Brenda like she was seeing her for the first time. Eric stepped forward in front of the whole room. "I'm sorry," he said, loud enough for everyone. "I let this go on for years because it was easier than standing up to my own mother. Samantha didn't deserve any of this." "You planned this?" Brenda said, her voice cracking. "No," I said quietly, "you did." Linda stood. "I've treated combat veterans for 30 years, she said, looking at Brenda. "She isn't broken." Then to me, softer, "She's the strongest person in this room." Brenda tried once more, reaching for relatives who wouldn't meet her eyes, insisting she'd only ever tried to hold the family together. "You were trying to hold on to it," Linda said. "That's not the same thing." Nobody argued with what they'd just seen. Her own words had done more damage than anything I could have said myself. If any part of this feels familiar to you, know that you're not weak for staying quiet as long as you did. Sometimes patience isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the beginning of a plan. If this story is speaking to you, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because Samantha still has to figure out what comes after the truth finally comes out. Take care of yourself. We left an hour later. Eric didn't speak until we were in the car. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have seen it years ago." "I know," I said. "That's not an excuse." "No," I agreed. "It isn't. But it was a beginning. And after everything, a beginning was more than I'd let myself hope for." The weeks that followed weren't dramatic. There was no final showdown, no second confrontation. Eric changed every lock in the house himself, one door at a time, testing each new key twice before he was satisfied. When he finished, he handed me both copies without me having to ask. "That's it," he said. "Nobody else gets one." Not without both of us agreeing first. It was such a small thing, 2 keys sitting in my palm. But it was the first time since coming home that I felt like the house actually belonged to the person standing in it. The routines came back slower than I expected. For weeks after the intervention, I still found myself checking the doorbell app out of habit, even after the locks were changed, even after there was nothing left to catch. Old vigilance doesn't leave just because the threat does. I told Dr. Reyes about it once, half embarrassed, and he told me that was normal, that bodies remember danger longer than minds do, and that the checking would fade on its own timeline, not mine. He was right, eventually. It took months, not days, but one morning I noticed I'd gone 3 days without opening the app at all, and it felt like something worth marking, even if there was no one to tell. I started gardening again that summer, properly this time, replanting the flower bed Brenda had dug up months earlier. I put the marigolds back. Eric helped, badly, uprooting more than he planted, and I let him anyway, because it turned out I didn't actually mind him being bad at something as long as he was trying it beside me instead of somewhere else entirely. That December, for the first time since coming home, I hosted Christmas. Not Brenda. Me in my own kitchen, with my own mother's mixing bowls back where they belonged, the ones Brenda had crowded out with her own set the very first month I was home. Eric strung lights along the porch while I cooked, and Linda arrived early to help. The two of us laughing over a recipe I kept getting wrong, flour on the counter, the oven timer going off twice before either of us noticed. Eric's uncle brought his famous pie, the same one he'd been bringing to family gatherings for 20 years, and set it down on the counter with a small, deliberate nod toward me, the kind of gesture that didn't need words attached to it. The teenage niece showed up wearing a jacket she said she'd bought for the tire lesson and asked if we could do it again in the spring. Even the cousin who'd apologized by the coffee pot months earlier stayed longer than she needed to, helping dry dishes at the sink, telling me about a job she was thinking of leaving, the kind of ordinary conversation that only happens once. Trust has quietly rebuilt itself underneath it. Somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, standing at my own stove in my own kitchen, surrounded by people who'd finally chosen to see me clearly, I realized I hadn't thought about Brenda once all day. It wasn't a triumph. It didn't feel like winning something. It just felt like an ordinary Tuesday finally arriving on a Thursday, 3 years later than it should have, but here all the same. I heard, secondhand, that Brenda still tells people I was hard to help, that she sacrificed a great deal for a family that turned against her. I don't know if she believes it or if it's simply the only story she has left to hold on to. Either way, I stopped needing her version to match mine a long time ago. Some people would rather lose everyone than lose the story where they were right, and by the time I understood that about her, I'd already stopped waiting for it to change. Eric changed in ways that surprised me even after the counseling ended. He started calling his own doctor's office instead of asking me to remember his appointments. He told a coworker no, flatly, when asked to cover a weekend shift for the 3rd time in a month, something the old Eric would have agreed to just to avoid the discomfort of refusing. Small things. But I'd learned by then that small things were usually where the truth of a person actually lived. One night, almost 2 years after I came home, we sat at our own kitchen table over a dinner he'd cooked from scratch. No recipe card, nothing burned. I watched him move around the kitchen with an ease that hadn't been there before, and I thought about the man who used to hand every hard decision to whoever was loudest in the room. "You're different," I told him. He set down 2 plates and sat across from me. "So are you. Good different or bad different? The only kind that matters," he said. "The kind we chose." I reached across the table and took his hand, and for a moment neither of us said anything else. We didn't need to. Some conversations are better finished in silence, the two of you just sitting there fully known, in a house that had finally, after everything, become exactly what it was always supposed to be. Brenda didn't apologize again. Word travels quietly through a family once the truth settles in. A few relatives who'd sat in that room called me in the days after, awkward, careful, trying to find words for what they hadn't seen sooner. I accepted every one of those calls. I understood by then that most of them hadn't been cruel. They'd simply trusted the wrong voice for too long, the same way I once had. Carol, the neighbor who used to pat my arm at the mailbox, stopped me one afternoon a few weeks later. "I heard some of it," she said carefully. "I'm sorry. I should have asked you instead of just believing her." "You didn't know," I said. "I could have found out," she said, "and that was honest enough that I let it be enough." Church friends of Brenda's stopped mentioning her name around me at all, which told me everything I needed to know about what they'd finally understood without anyone having to say it out loud. Eric's aunt called me one evening that first month, her voice unsteady. "I keep thinking about that dinner," she said, "the one where Brenda brought up the wellness facility." I remember thinking it felt wrong, and I didn't say anything. I've replayed that 100 times since. "You're saying something now," I told her. "It doesn't undo staying quiet, then." "No," I agreed. "But it's not nothing either. Most people in that room stayed quiet a lot longer than you did." She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "I don't know how you did it." Sat there and just waited, built the whole case without anyone knowing. "I didn't feel brave," I told her. "I felt like I didn't have another option that wouldn't cost me something worse. Sometimes that's what patience actually is. Not calm, just the absence of a better plan yet." She laughed, a small, surprised sound. That's the most honest thing anyone's said to me about any of this. We talked for a while longer, about nothing important, the kind of conversation that matters more for what it repairs than what it says. It was the first of several calls like that over the following months, small threads of a family slowly reweaving themselves around the shape of what had actually happened, instead of the shape Brenda had spent years insisting on. A few months later, Eric's aunt hosted a smaller family gathering. No fanfare, just coffee and pie on a Saturday afternoon. I almost didn't go. Linda talked me into it. You don't owe anyone a performance of forgiveness, she said. But you also don't have to disappear from your own family because of what one person did. I went. It was strange at first, sitting in a room with people who'd watched that footage play out on a television months earlier. But nobody brought it up directly. Instead, Eric's uncle asked me about the tree I'd planted. The teenage niece, the one who'd looked up from her phone that night at dinner, sat next to me on the porch steps and asked quietly if it was true I used to fix helicopters. Something like that, I said. And for the next 20 minutes, we didn't talk about Brenda at all. We talked about deployments, about the sound of a Black Hawk at dawn, about nothing that mattered and everything that did. It was the first ordinary family afternoon I'd had since coming home, and I didn't realize how much I'd missed the word ordinary until I was sitting inside it again. Eric tried to reach his mother once, a few weeks after the intervention. He sat across from her at a coffee shop, hoping for something that resembled ownership of what she'd done. "Mom," he said, "I just need you to say you understand why this hurt Samantha." "I understand that you've chosen a side," Brenda said, stirring her coffee without drinking it. "You've always been easily led, Eric, ever since you were a boy." "This isn't about sides." "It's about what you did." "What I did," she said, "was raise a family alone for years while your father checked out and give everything I had to keeping this one together. And now I'm the villain because I refused to sit quietly while a stranger walked back into my son's life and expected me to disappear." "She's not a stranger. She's my wife." Brenda's jaw tightened. "She was gone for 22 years, Eric. I was here." He told me later that was the sentence that finally made everything click into place for him. Not the videos, not the messages. That single sentence, spoken flatly across a coffee shop table, told him everything he needed to know about what his mother actually believed she was owed. He came home from that conversation quieter than I'd ever seen him. "She's not going to change, is she?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "Maybe not," I said. "That doesn't mean you failed. It just means some people would rather lose their family than admit they were wrong." He didn't try again after that. She chose, in the end, to hold on to her version of events rather than sit inside the discomfort of a truer one. I used to think that would bother me more than it did. Mostly, it just made me sad for her, the way you feel sad for someone standing on a shore you've already left. A cousin on Eric's side called one afternoon that summer, asking if she could stop by just for an hour while I was at a doctor's appointment, the exact phrase Brenda used to use. Eric answered the phone. "Actually, let's plan something when we're both home," he said. "That works better for us now." It was such a small sentence. But I heard about it that evening, and I sat on the edge of our bed for a minute just holding it, turning it over the way I used to turn over the coin. A year earlier, he would have said yes without thinking, and I would have come home to find someone in my kitchen I hadn't invited. This time, he'd made the decision on his own, without me in the room, and he'd made the one I would have made myself. "You didn't have to check with me first," I told him. "I know," he said. "That's kind of the point." A few weeks after that, a similar test came from the other direction, one I didn't expect. An old army friend called, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, asking if she could stay with us for a few nights while she was in town. My first instinct, old and automatic, was to say yes without checking with Eric first. The same reflex I used to criticize in him. I caught myself halfway through the sentence. "Let me talk to Eric and call you back," I said instead, and it felt strange in my mouth. That small pause, that small deference to a partnership instead of a decision made alone in either direction. Eric laughed when I told him about it that night. "Look at you," he said. asking permission like the rest of us mortals. Don't get used to it, I said, but I meant it a little less than I sounded like I did. Eric and I started marriage counseling that spring, not because our marriage was broken beyond repair, but because we'd built years of habits around avoiding hard conversations, and habits like that don't disappear just because the immediate threat is gone. Our counselor, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Reyes, asked us in our second session what we thought neutrality had cost us. It cost me my wife's trust, Eric said. For a while, anyway. And what did it cost you? Dr. Reyes asked, turning to me. It cost me believing I was allowed to take up space in my own home, I said. We worked on that, session by session, slowly. Eric learned to say things out loud the moment he felt them, instead of waiting for a problem to become impossible to ignore. I learned, more slowly, that asking for something wasn't the same as being a burden. A few sessions in, Dr. Reyes asked me a question nobody had asked me in 22 years. What does safety actually feel like to you, Samantha? Not the absence of danger. The presence of something. I sat with that for a long moment. I used to think it meant nobody needed anything from me, I finally said. I think I was wrong about that. What do you think now? I think it means somebody's paying attention, and I don't have to earn it. A month later, in a different session, he asked me something harder. Do you think you'll ever forgive her? I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word for what I want, I said. I don't need her to feel bad. I just needed her to stop, and she stopped, even if it took a room full of people and a television to make that happen. Maybe that's enough. Maybe forgiveness is something I do for myself later, on my own schedule, and it doesn't have anything to do with whether she ever earns it. That sounds like something you already know how to do, Dr. Reyes said. Wait for the right moment. Move only when you understand exactly what you're dealing with. I almost laughed. He didn't know about the coin, about observation coming before action, about 22 years of training folded into that one sentence. But he'd found the shape of it anyway, sitting in a beige office with a box of tissues on the table between us. There's a version of me, somewhere back in that first week home, who genuinely believed the hardest part of her life was already behind her. I don't think I could have told her otherwise, not in a way she'd have believed. Some things you only understand from the other side of them. What I know now, that I didn't know then, is that coming home was never going to be the end of anything. It was just a different kind of front line, quieter, wearing a familiar face, asking me to defend something I hadn't realized was already under attack. Eric reached over and took my hand in the waiting room afterward, and neither of us said anything about it, because we'd finally learned that some things didn't need to be said to be real. Some nights we sat on the back porch and didn't talk about any of it at all. We just sat there, the way we used to imagine we would when I finally came home for good, back when neither of us understood how much work that word home would actually take. Eric started cooking dinner twice a week, badly at first, and I let him keep trying instead of taking over, which was its own small kind of practice. Linda came around more often after that. She and I would sit at the kitchen table some evenings, coffee going cold between us, talking about nothing in particular, and I understood, somewhere in those quiet hours, that this was what I'd actually been fighting for the whole time. Not a house, not being right, just this. Ordinary evenings that belonged to nobody but us. Almost a year after the intervention, Eric's aunt hosted the family's first real holiday gathering since everything came apart. I almost didn't go. I stood in our bedroom that morning holding a dish I'd made, wondering if walking back into that house would undo something I'd worked hard to rebuild. You don't have to go, Eric said from the doorway. I know, I said. I want to. The house looked different without Brenda arranging every corner of it. Quieter in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. Eric's uncle pulled me aside near the coffee pot and told me, gruffly, that he should have said something the night of that dinner, the one where his sister first mentioned the wellness facility. I've thought about that 100 times since, he said. I'm sorry I didn't. You're saying it now, I told him. That counts for something. A cousin I barely knew, one who'd sat quietly through the entire intervention without saying a word, found me by the coffee pot later and admitted she'd almost texted me an apology a dozen times over the past year and never sent it. "I didn't know what to say," she said. "I still don't, really. I just know I should have said something instead of just watching it happen." "You're saying something now," I told her, the same thing I'd told her Uncle minutes earlier, and I meant it every time. I wasn't interested in punishing people for having been slow to understand. I was interested in whether they understood now, and whether that understanding changed how they showed up going forward. Most of them did. The teenage niece found me on the back porch again, older now by a year, and asked if I'd teach her how to change a tire before she got her license. I said yes without hesitating. It struck me later that this, more than anything, was what winning had actually looked like. Not a courtroom, not an apology I never got. Just a girl asking a grown woman in her family to teach her something useful, the way families are supposed to work when nobody's rewriting the story underneath you. Brenda wasn't there. Nobody mentioned her name all afternoon, and for the first time, that absence didn't feel like a wound. It just felt like a fact. One morning, months later, I planted a young tree in our front yard. The dirt was cool under my hands, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the yard felt entirely, simply mine. Eric knelt beside me, and I reached into my pocket and placed the challenge coin into his palm. He turned it over, running his thumb across the worn edge the way I used to. "Why now?" "I carried that through every deployment," I said. "I thought my hardest battles were overseas." I looked toward our house, sunlight catching the new lock on the front door. Turns out the one that mattered most was right here. He closed his hand around the coin and helped me to my feet, and we walked inside together, the door closing behind us the way it should have felt the whole time I'd been home. Quiet, certain, ours. I think about that morning a lot. The cool dirt under my hands, the small tree still bending in the wind, too young yet to hold its own weight without a stake to help it stand. I think about how much of my life I spent believing that carrying everything alone was the only kind of strength worth having, and how long it took me to learn that letting someone stand beside me wasn't weakness at all. Sometimes I think about the version of myself who set that coin in a kitchen drawer the day I came home, so sure the hardest part was finally behind her. I wish I could tell her it wasn't over yet, that the real test was still waiting, quiet and polite, wearing a warm smile and carrying a casserole dish. But I don't think she would have believed me. I don't think I would have believed me either. Some things you only learn by living through them, one small boundary at a time, until one day you look up and realize you're standing in a house that finally completely belongs to you. If there's one thing I'd want someone else in my position to hear, it's this. You don't have to raise your voice to be taken seriously, and you don't have to prove your pain to anyone who's already decided not to believe it. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is exactly what you were trained to do all along. Watch, wait, gather what's true. And when the moment finally comes, let the truth do the work you were always too polite to do yourself. I served 22 years defending a flag I still believe in places most people will never have to see. But nothing in those 2 decades taught me as much about courage as the year I spent learning to defend a kitchen table, a front door, and a marriage I'd almost let slip away out of politeness. For the first time in years, it finally felt like a house I didn't have to defend. It just felt like home,